Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name's Talia Moore, and I used to be a postdoc in EEB, and now I'm a research scientist in robotics. So thank you for coming to our 5th talk in the Robotics Interfaces Seminar Series, and the first talk in our EEB Thursday seminar series for this academic year. So we're really grateful that EEB has allowed us to co-host today's talk during your regular seminar time. Unlike many other robotics institutes or departments, Robotics is surrounded by departments all across campus that are leading in their fields. We created this series to feature outstanding work being done with robots outside of engineering to build bridges and encourage collaborations all across campus, as well as expand our definitions of who can be roboticists. This seminar series is supported by the Diversity Innovation Fund and the Robotics Institute. Additional funding for this seminar was provided by EEB. We are interested in measuring the impact of this seminar series, so please fill out a survey. They're on the back corner table over there. There is delicious food in the kitchen provided by M Catering as a reward for turning in your survey after the talk. We've got 3 different platters, including a specifically cookie platter. And we've got maize and blue punch. So this week, we are delighted to have Professor Gail Patricelli from UC Davis. Professor Patricelli started off at Whitman College, then obtained her master's and PhD from the University of Maryland, studying with Gerald Borgia, is that how you say it? Where she studied bowerbird communication and mate choice, and first incorporated robotics into her research. She did an NSF postdoc at the Lab of Ornithology at Cornell, where she studied the songs of red-winged blackbirds, and since then has been a professor at UC Davis. Her work has been published in journals such as Proceedings of the Royal Society B, Current Zoology, Behavioral Ecology, and Nature multiple times. And through her research, she works with several government and non-governmental agencies to inform land management practices. I'm really excited to hear about how she uses Fembots to study sage-grouse sexual selection, so please join me in welcoming Professor Gail Patricelli.
Okay, can you hear me? That's good, all right. And then you can all see me, right? I'm not so short that you can't see me. I don't have to stand. I'm worried if I stand on the stage, I'll trip and fall off, and that would be very embarrassing. Okay, so thank you for being here. I'm so glad it worked out. I was scheduled to be here, I can't remember exactly when it was, and then the polar vortex hit. And so we decided to cancel it the night before instead of me coming out and talking to an empty room full or a few people with big puffy jackets on. So I'm so glad we were able to reschedule it and that I'm able to be here and meet people. So today I'm going to talk about the research we've been doing in my lab with sage-grouse. I'm going to start talking about the bowerbird system because I just want to give you a little bit more history about how I've been using robotics in my work. And so Darwin's theory of natural selection is, of course, very powerful in explaining the evolution of traits such as camouflage, coloration. And so, for example, in this first panel, it's the common patu, that's the mom, and that's the chick pretending to be a stick, or the common barren caterpillar hanging out in plain sight, or the leaf-tailed gecko right here. So of course, natural selection is very powerful in shaping these kinds of traits, helping animals to stay alive so that they can pass on their genes. But natural selection alone has a more difficult time explaining the animals like the peacock. And so Darwin himself proposed the solution to this problem, which is his theory of sexual selection, which proposes that these elaborate traits aid in reproduction and that the genes for the traits therefore spread in the population. And one way that these traits can aid in reproduction is by female choice. So if females preferentially mate with more ornamented males. In some species, it's mutual mate choice or male-driven mate choice. But in the cases I'll talk about today, it's really dominated by female choice. And so if we ask the question, why does the peacock look like this? The answer is because peahens demand it. So peahens over evolutionary time have shaped these gorgeous creatures and all of their displays to suit their aesthetic tastes, right? And so what's in it for the female? In a lot of these different species, certainly the species I'll talk about today, the females are not choosing a male who's going to provide more parental care, helping her raise the kids. She's going to mate with him, and then that's the end of their relationship. So why does she care if she mates with a guy that has more eye spots on his train, which seems to be one of the traits under selection? Why does it make a difference? And so females may benefit from being choosy if male displays convey some sort of information that benefits benefits females that they may gain through their mate choice. So this can include genetic benefits, so beneficial genes for their offspring. So that might be genes that encode for better immune system function or some other aspect of health, or simply more attractive display traits in their male offspring, so sexier sons. Or there could be direct benefits, so any benefit that increases female fecundity or offspring survival. And because males don't provide any parental care in this species, really one of the main direct benefits might just be avoiding parasite transmission. So avoiding males that look like they're covered in parasites means she might catch fewer of them or something like that. So those are the possibilities for why she may be choosy, or those are the two of the dominant hypotheses for why females may be choosy. But courtships aren't just the male unfurling his train and then the female standing there counting eye spots, and then that's the end of it. Courtships are often more like a negotiation than an advertisement. They involve counterpositioning and chasing and interaction and all sorts of things besides just standing there counting eye spots. And they often involve 3 categories of tasks, all of which may affect fitness. And so this is true for both males and females during courtship. There's lots of tasks that they have to perform. And so we can think about these as, first, there's a situation choice, so the where and the when. So if you're a female, you have to choose a good location to go search for possible mates. And if you're a male, you have to choose a good location to display where the light is flattering, or there's not too much background noise so you can't be heard, or where there's not so much competition from other sexier guys that you're going to get ignored, something like that, right? So choosing a good display location. There's also an engagement choice, so the who do you engage in courtship interactions? So both the male and the female may be choosy about who they invest time in assessing as a possible mate. And then execution choice, so there's lots of how questions. So males, for example, need to approach the female without freaking her out and scaring her away. If you watch animal courtship in the wild, including on campus, for example, not everybody is equally good at this, right? And so we see this on the sage-grouse lek all the time, that males will go barreling right up to females and the females run away before they even get a chance to show off. So you have to approach the female, they have to interact appropriately once they do approach the female, and then they need to allocate their effort among potential courtship interactions. So if they have a pool of energy to spend, they have to spend it well among the possible mates. And so the optimal solutions for all of these kinds of tasks depend on the behavior of others of the same and opposite sex. So the best tactic to use may depend on what other individuals are doing, what the opposite sex is doing, as well as the environment. So are you in high predation risk or low predation risk? And all sorts of different aspects of the environment can play into this too. So this is complex stuff, right? And so the peacock spider here is spectacular and beautiful and has clearly gorgeous visual displays. But if you look at courtship in this species, they are running around chasing each other through the leaf litter, and the female is assessing the male but also trying to catch him and eat him. So if she doesn't like what she sees, she may catch him and eat him. And so his display is not, his success in mating is not just about bright colors and color patterns. It's about staying alive. So here's a little video clip of this where he's fanning out his display, and the female is basically chasing after him. So clearly there's a lot of things that he has to do right to survive this whole encounter, but also convince her to mate. Okay, so these are complex tasks. And individuals may differ in their ability to approach that sort of best or that optimal behavior, the behavior that's most likely to lead to successful reproduction. And so sexual selection may favor not just the evolution of elaborate traits like the peacock's train and bright colors and songs, but also social skills needed to choose that best tactic and execute it well. So the ability to interact appropriately in these social situations. And classic display traits, like the peacock's train, when we measure variation among individuals in those classic display traits, and then ask how much of the difference among males in mating success does this variation explain, it's usually a pretty small fraction, a mean of about 4 to 10%, sometimes up to 30 or 40% of the variation. But even in those cases where we're explaining 30 or 40%, there's 70% or 60% of the variation that we're not explaining, and why some individuals are more successful than others. So even when we look at all the different components of the display, we may still be missing a lot by not looking at these other kinds of social skills. And so few studies have examined the fitness consequences of variation in social skills. So looking at how individuals differ and whether they're able to execute that sort of best behavior and how that relates to their fitness. So whether or not they're able to reproduce. Very few studies have examined those fitness consequences of variation in social skills in courtship because it's really hard to do. So first we need to know the best behavior. So you need to have some sort of model that predicts what the animals should be doing, and then you can compare how animals, or how close they get to that. Or you need to have some sort of proxy of fitness. So in the studies I've been doing, we often use mating success or courtship success as some measure of their success in mating. Or you could look at the number of offspring, or there's lots of different ways that we might measure that. So that's one thing we need to have. And then we need to be able to collect detailed measurements of subtle male and female behaviors, the social context, et cetera. And that's hard to do because we have to film this whole scenario, everything that's playing out, and score it in very great detail. And that takes a lot of time. It's hard to know exactly what to measure in these situations. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. And then we need to determine who is responding to whom in these interactions. So if it's a male and female interacting, or two males or two females interacting, you have to tease apart who's influencing who. If you want to measure the one individual's social skills, how those are going to play out is going to be determined by who he's interacting with, right? So you need to figure out some way to measure their social abilities that sort of teases apart that interplay. And so that requires experiments to either control one side of that interaction or to somehow control the social context. And that's where the robots come in, right? So we can control one side of that interaction and then measure responsiveness of the other side. And so for courtship skills, only a handful of studies have done this so far. There's other aspects of social skills that people have measured in a wider array of different systems. But there's only a few cases where we've been able to measure the variation of this and relate it to fitness, to see how sexual selection is acting on these traits. And so I'll tell you about two studies from my dissertation work and now from my lab at UC Davis, where we have been trying to do this. And so first I'll tell you about my dissertation research on satin bowerbirds, and then I'll tell you about my work on greater sage-grouse. And so, they're both birds, but they're very different birds. And so let me tell you a little bit about both species. So first we have the bowerbirds. They're very intelligent. There's some evidence that, that females are preferring males who are better at solving cognitive tasks. So we've done some tests with them. They have to build this structure to impress females, gather decorations. So what they're doing is very complex. So they're very intelligent birds. Sage-grouse, technically speaking, are not the sharpest knives in the avian drawer. They're as smart as they need to be to do their sage-grouse thing, but they're not going to be winning any Fields medals, right, amongst the birds. And so, yeah. That is a big difference between these two guys. The bowerbirds, we always had a sense that they were studying us too. And you don't get that sense with the sage-grouse. There's also difference in the amount of variability we see. So the bowerbirds, there's a huge individual variation in displays. All the individuals were different. You could recognize their bowers and the decorations, and there's just a lot of individual variation within individuals and among individuals. In the sage-grouse, their display has been described as a fixed action pattern. It's actually in a lot of old ethology textbooks as an example of a fixed action pattern, meaning that it's something that's done exactly the same way every time. And I would argue that that's not true, that it's not actually that fixed. There is quite a bit of variability in there, but even so, the range of variability is tiny compared to the range of variability we see in the satin bowerbirds. So it's a very different kind of display. In the satin bowerbirds, we also have what's called delayed plumage maturation. So the males don't molt into their adult blue plumage until they're 7 years old. The first 7 years of their lives, they look just like females, and they fly around getting courted by adult males, seeming to learn how to do this whole courtship display and how to build the bower. And if you give them a testosterone injection when they're only 2 years old and make them into an adult, they build a really crappy bower, and they don't know how to sing or dance or do their thing. So it takes a long time to learn to be a good bowerbird. So learning seems to be very important. In sage-grouse, the importance of learning is really unknown. There's some hints that there's some learning going on, but much, much less than we would see in the bowerbirds. And so in both of these cases, I was interested in studying these social skills during courtship and the importance of these in determining who's successful in mating. And so in both cases, I built robots to be able to go out there and study these things. And spoiler alert, in both cases, males are responding to female signals. So very different species, but in both cases, there seems to have been selection to be able to respond appropriately to female signals. So just a little bit about the robots, since I'm talking here to a robotics group as well as the EEB group. And so robots are basically, it's a playback experiment. So playback experiments are one of the earliest tools in the toolkit of animal behaviorists. And I dug into this a little bit, and the first playback experiment was in 1890 using wax cylinders. So as soon as they learned how to record sounds from nature, someone went out and recorded a monkey at a zoo and then played the recording back to another monkey to see what they would do, right? So that's basically what a playback experiment is. You find out what this signal means, what this vocalization means, by seeing what the other animal does in response to it. Do they get angry? Do they hide? Are they fearful? Do they approach it? So this is one of the ways that we in animal behavior study how signals are used in the social lives of animals. And so robots are basically a way of doing a playback experiment with a visual signal that allows you to do more interaction. And some of the earliest visual playbacks were Tinbergen, one of the fathers of animal behavior studies, who put like just a paper mache head of a gull that he had painted to look like a gull on the end of a stick, and then just like poked it at some gulls to see what they would do. And he was able to see how they responded to that different visual signal. So this is, I would hope, a more sophisticated version of a paper mache gull head on a stick. But it's really part of the same sort of tradition of the playback experiment. Okay, so a little bit about satin bowerbirds, a little bit more about satin bowerbirds. These are fantastic birds. They're found in Australia. And so male bowerbirds build bowers. So the bower is this two-walled stick structure with a platform of sticks out in front. Females assess male displays. So this is a female. She will fly around the valley. The bowers are about 100 meters apart. She'll fly around the valley, land in the bower, and watch the male do his song and dance. He dances on his platform. And she'll fly around and check out quite a few different males before she decides who she wants to mate with. There's no male paternal care, so males are not helping take care of the young. So after the female mates with the male, that's the end of their relationship. He turns around and tries to court the next female. She flies away and takes care of the young entirely on her own. And so males then can mate as many times as they can convince females to mate with them, right? Because they don't have to then go take care of their kids. And so this can lead to very strong sexual selection. And we see then a very skewed mating success. So there were often a few individuals who did almost all of the matings and many males who didn't get to mate at all. And so females were preferring males that had nice, symmetrical bower with nice little sticks that were well woven and all about the same size. And they decorate their bower platform with different objects. And you can see that they love the color blue. So blue parrot feathers would have been important over evolutionary history, but now we have blue milk bottle rings, and they used to regularly break into our cabin and steal blue ballpoint pens. And one of my favorite decorations I saw was a blue baby's pacifier, because I imagined it like plucking it out of the mouth of a screaming baby to put on his bower. And so this is one of the ways that they impress females. So there's lots of different sexually selected traits. And so male display is very intense. So this is a video of one of the bowers. So here's the two walls right here. There's the female. Here's the male, and his decorations are out in front. And when he does his song and dance, he dances with, usually it's a yellow leaf in his bill to impress the female. And so male display is very intense and aggressive. It's actually the same display that they use to intimidate other males when they're at feeding sites. So if they want a piece of food and another guy's going for it, they'll do the same display. And females prefer more intense displays, but they're often startled if he's too intense before she's ready. So you see females very jumpy early on in courtship, and then as courtship progresses, if she's actually interested in him, she'll start crouching downwards a little bit. And so females often crouch slowly downwards during courtship, and when they do, they're less likely to be startled. So the more they're crouching, the less likely they are to be startled, whereas when they first arrive and are standing upright, they're much more likely to be startled. Whoops. So this is courtship. Now as a startle, you saw the female jump up there. Now he's going to mimic a kookaburra and a Lewin's honey eater. And then he does a crow and two different species of cockatoos. So it's an amazing mimicry. It sounds like a perfect audio recording if you've ever heard those birds in the wild. So they're really only a few inches away from the female doing this, loud and sudden displays. And so males that startle females less often are less successful in mating. And so we wanted to know whether males were paying attention to this crouching. So when they're crouching, they're less likely to be startled. So if he's paying attention to crouching, he can tone down his display until she's crouching more and then avoid startling the female. So we tested the hypothesis that males are paying attention to this subtle behavior in the female, and we predicted that they should increase their intensity as crouching increases. That way they're able to put on an intense display without startling the female by waiting until she's more comfortable. So to test this hypothesis, this is where the robot came in, right? So we need a female that we can manipulate her crouching behavior and see whether males respond. And if you just look at natural courtships to do this, the females behave differently when they're being courted by attractive or unattractive males. Some of the males don't really even get females to show up for courtship. And so the robot gives us the ability to test all the males on a level playing field, give them the same female stimulus and see how they respond. So this is the electronic innards of the robot, and this was cutting edge in 1995 when this was built. And this was my state-of-the-art robot fabrication facility in Australia. So these are skins, taxidermied skins of the bird placed over the top of a shell over the robotics. And so I could go out and place the robot inside the bower and then take the remote control and go hide in a blind and control her behavior. And then when everything was set up, I would sort of reveal the robot by removing a cloth that was blocking it. The male then arrives at his bower and finds a female there and starts courting the female. So the first video clip I'm going to show you is a little bit of trial and error, some of the debugging we had to do to get this to work. So this was one of the very first tests of the robot. So luckily we figured that out quickly. And so this is a more successful version of the robot. So you can see she looks back and forth to appear more natural. She crouches downwards, and then when she's fully crouched, she can spread her wings out a little bit, which is the solicitation posture that the birds get into when they're ready to actually mate. And so we can have her doing that crouching behavior at different rates. Here's a male courting the robot. In case you're not totally convinced of the allure of the robot. The robots can only dance with as much rhythm as the biologist controlling them. So, yeah. Anyway, yes, respect the power of the robotic females. Okay, so we tested all the males. That was, by the way, the last night of our final field season. We built a little stage. We had headlamps, and yeah, it was very fun. So we measured responsiveness of all the males in the population, and so to do that, we basically looked at how male display intensity varied across these different robot crouch rate treatments, right? So I had some treatments where I would put the robot on the bower and then not have her crouch, so she stayed upright the whole time, all the way over to fast crouching, relatively quickly moving into that solicitation posture. And then we looked at how the intensity of male display changed along with this. And you can see that males adjust their display intensity in response to these robotic female signals. And so the display intensity is how much they puff up, which is used as a threat display, and how far they run and how quickly or how far they spread their wings out when they buzz. So there were lots of different aspects of the vigor of the display that I compiled together into an index for intensity. So we can see that males respond, but there's variability in how exactly they respond. So we looked at that variability. So are more responsive males more successful? And so to get a measure of responsiveness for each male, we looked at how his intensity varied across those crouch rate treatments. And you can see there's different slopes among males. So we used that slope as a measure of responsiveness. And we found that more responsive males startled real females less often during courtship. Right? So it's not about whether they startle the robot, because that doesn't happen. Those males are also startling real females less often during courtship if they're more responsive. And the most successful males are those males that can produce a high intensity display without threatening females. So they have to be able to produce a high intensity display, but they have to do it without scaring females. And they do that in part by responding to female signals. So only putting on their highest intensity if the female has signaled that she's ready for that. And so males do this by adjusting their display intensity in response to female signals. And so both social skills and the ability to produce this high intensity display were about equally important in explaining the variation among individuals in their courtship success, suggesting that these social skills are an important aspect of success in this species. And we also see that it's related to other famous things that bowerbirds do. So satin bowerbirds famously collect these blue decorations to decorate their bower. And the number of blue decorations is related to mating success. So males with lots of blue are more successful at convincing females to mate. And we found that females were less likely to be startled by males who had more blue decorations on their bowers. And so once they arrive, they see lots of blue decorations. Either they're sort of mesmerized into calming down, or they can see that he's a pretty good male and are just less likely to be scared by him. We don't know exactly what the mechanism is, but these blue decorations seem to interact with her response to his behavioral displays. And so controlling for startling, blue decorations are no longer related to male mating success. That doesn't mean that they're not important. It just might mean that their action sort of goes through that behavioral display. And so our understanding of the role of this key sexual signal changes when we examine it in the context of these courtship interactions between the males and females. Okay, so shifting gears then to talk about our more recent work with sage-grouse. So this work was done, most of the work I'll tell you about today was done at our field site in Lander, Wyoming, which is just on the east side of the Wind River Range, which is a beautiful patch of the Rocky Mountains. More recently, we've been working in the eastern Sierras, so just around Mono Lake, the east side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And so this is our Wyoming field site. We basically build our own little trailer park in the middle of nowhere, and we stay out there for 3 or 4 months so that we're right next to where the birds are during the breeding season. We've had lots and lots of field crews who have helped us over the years to do this work. That was a particularly epic field crew photo. And more recently in California, we've had over 400 undergrads in the lab help us analyze all these videos as well. And so we're out there to study sage-grouse on the lek. So the lek is where mating happens in the species. And so males gather together in a big arena and puff up and strut around. Females visit this area to comparison shop for a mate. That's what a lek is. And lek breeding systems have some of the most elaborate display traits you see in any species. So the peacocks or peafowl are one example of this. Manakins, birds of paradise, a lot of these have lek breeding systems. And so this is kind of where sexual selection runs amok, where it can go to its most extreme cases. And so this photo, by the way, is right from nearby our field site. This is one of the biggest leks that exists now, and it gets up to 800 birds. And there's now very, very few leks like that. Lewis and Clark described leks like this all over the West. But now these are pretty rare. And sadly, they just sold permission to drill for oil and gas about 2 months ago in that very area. So there's nothing more to say about that. That sucks. But hopefully it won't happen. But anyway, this is what happens on the lek. So this is one of the peak days of breeding. The sound is in real time. The rest is sped up. So you can see these are all hens. These are the males doing their displays. Only one of the males is getting any actual matings. The rest of the males are dancing and doing their things. So most of the mating happens in just a few different days, but there's a lot of mating sort of earlier and later, but then there's sort of a few chaotic peak days of breeding like this one. And so females will comparison shop, visit multiple males, copulate with a male on the lek, and then again, they'll leave, tend the eggs, and raise the young entirely on their own. So at the end of the morning, they're out there for a few hours every morning. In this case, they all got flushed off by a raptor flying nearby. At some point, I think that guy, yeah. So that's what it's like on a morning on the lek during the chaotic peak of breeding. Most of the time, it's not quite that chaotic, and so we can actually see what's happening. It's almost too chaotic on those few days of breeding. But this is what this looks like up close, looking at individual males. And so you can see they're very fancy. So they have a lot going on. They have yellow combs over their eyes that erect, and they have phyloplume feathers by their head. They have these white chest feathers that are modified to make a swishing sound that you'll hear. Spiky tail feathers, lots going on. So this is what this looks like. That is a belch. We can tell them apart by the pattern of white spots on their backsides, their butt prints. And so that sound that they produce it starts out with the mechanical sound of the wings swishing across the feathers, and then it's followed by a vocal sound that they resonate in this huge vocal sac, which is their esophagus. So they basically swallow air and inflate their esophagus into a giant balloon that acts as a resonator. And if you were a female sage-grouse, you would swoon over this, right? So this is super slow-mo. That was real time. Now you can see the very slow-mo version beginning with the Baywatch run across the snow here. That's another male somewhere off in the distance. So you can see they'll start with the swish, and you can see the wings across the modified feathers on the chest. So it's a stridulation sound like crickets might make. So it's deeply weird and obscene and all sorts of different things. And it's also really complex and happens over a very brief period of time. And so they do this all morning long, over and over and over again for a few hours every morning. Okay, so what do we know about sexual selection in sage-grouse? So before I tell you about what we know about sexual selection, just to give you a sense of why lek breeding systems can be so crazy. So this male right here is sort of legendary in our project. He is the top breeding male from cottontail lek in 2012, and he mated more than any male we've ever monitored. And so he mated well over 130 times during that breeding season, which is just a few months long. And 37 of those matings were on the morning where I took this photo. And 23 of those matings were in a single 23-minute long period of time during which he mated once a minute for 23 straight minutes. It was very impressive. And so if you're a sexy sage-grouse, basically, the fitness payoff is enormous. That guy is passing on lots of genes to the next generation, right? And so there's very, very strong selection to be that guy, basically. And that's why sexual selection can be so extreme in these lek breeding systems, because you have an extreme skew in mating success, and only a few guys are mating, and they're mating a lot, and most males are not passing on their genes. So this is one of the reasons why lekking systems are really fun and interesting to study, because things get wild and weird, as you can see. So what do we know about what females are actually choosing in a mate? We know that females are extremely picky, right? They almost all want to mate with the same few males. And so what is common with successful males? It doesn't seem to be about looks, or at least none of the visual traits that have been measured so far are related to mating success. It doesn't mean they're irrelevant, but we haven't been able to figure out what about the visual display matters. What we know is that successful males display at a high quantity. So they spend more days out there, and then when they're there, they strut like crazy. So they just perform this display over and over. And they display at a high quality. So they also sound good. So they show up and work hard, and then they also sound good while they're doing it. And there's a particular feature of the vocalization that females prefer, which is we can't hear the difference between attractive and unattractive vocalizations, but somehow females can. And displays, we know from previous studies, displays are energetically costly, and studies suggest that there might be a trade-off between quantity and quality, which is true in lots of different systems. Quantity-quality trade-offs are pretty common in nature. And so we examined whether males might manage this quality-quantity trade-off by tactically using their energy when it's most likely to lead to matings. And that is when females are close, based on past research. And so if they can't do quantity and quality necessarily at the same time, or they're not able to invest a huge amount in both, then they might be tactical about when they're using their signals and use their energy to the best advantage. And so to test this, we wanted to see how males respond to females when they're either far from the male or close to the male, and presence or absence of females. And so this is the very most primitive robot, the early first-generation robotic female sage-grouse, and me doing some bad taxidermy. So this was the first-generation robot, and she was just riding around on G-scale model train tracks so that we could keep everything very consistent among these different treatments. And we were worried about whether we could drive across the rough ground, and so we went with train tracks. So this is the first generation. She moves on train tracks, and it creates a controlled female stimulus, so we can test all the males with the same signal. It allows us to measure male display from the female's perspective, so she has a little video camera and a microphone on board. And so did they fall for this? She doesn't have legs, she's on train tracks. Yes, they did fall for it. And so one of the other key things about lekking systems is that the females are extremely picky and the males are not. So the males want to mate as much as possible in these really extreme breeding systems. 90% of birds are at least socially monogamous, and both sexes are going to be choosy. This is not that species, right? This is not that situation. And so when there are no real females around, we pretty regularly see males trying to mate with dried cow pies, which are sort of like brown and round and approximately the size of a female sage-grouse. So I don't think that they necessarily think that that's a female, but they're so keyed up to mate that the robot has to be more attractive than a cow pie, but not that much better, right? So the bar is low. So this is what it looks like from the onboard robot camera. So that was one of our early failed experiments, and it was totally worth it for the video. And we watched that same male with real females, and anytime a real female would get into his territory, he would go barreling right up to them, and the real females just got out of there. And so that was one of the things that got us looking at how males approach females without scaring them away before they even get a chance to show off. So anyway, it was worth it for the video, but also informative. Okay, so what did we find? So looking at these display trade-offs in sage-grouse, so first of all, this is all work done with my former postdoc, Alan Krakauer, who helped build this project from the very beginning. And so just very briefly, we found that males are adjusting their display rate in response to female presence and proximity. So they're basically, the successful guys are toning it way down when the females are not on the lek, and then cranking it up when the females are present. And then they increase their display rate as the female gets closer. And we know that when the females are close, that's when they're most assessing that male. So by doing that, they're strutting the most when it's most likely to influence her behavior and convince her to mate. Whereas the unsuccessful guys are just sort of blasting away at a mediocre level all the time, not paying attention to all of that social context. So the more responsive males can increase their display quantity, and so they're able to do that without showing the decline in quality. So the males that showed that quantity-quality trade-off were the unsuccessful males. The successful guys were able to save their energy and seem to be able to put on a good show, both quantity and quality. And so this suggests selection on the social skills, that males are better at executing that tactic. Males that are better at it mate more often, right? So paying attention to that social context. And so do males also respond to female signals and cues? So in the bowerbird system, I was looking at male response to those subtle female behaviors. Is that also happening in the sage-grouse? So this first experiment, the robot didn't have that many skills. She could look back and forth and move along the train tracks, but that was it. So we were just looking at presence, absence, and proximity. So the next generation robot, we needed to be able to imitate these female behaviors that we see during courtship. And so my former graduate student, Anna Perry, did this work, analyzing natural female behaviors to try to figure out what behaviors are associated with the likelihood to mate. And so she found that these female behaviors are associated with the probability that a female will solicit mating. So most of the time when females are on the lek, they walk around pecking at the ground, foraging. They are not just foraging there. They could be foraging anywhere. They've come to the lek to assess their mate, but they spend most of their time looking at the ground, only occasionally looking up and spending time sort of looking at the males. Once they're getting more interested in mating, they start spending more time upright. And so she studied these behaviors and looked at how those two behaviors relate to the probability that they're going to transition into soliciting a mating. And so she found that, in fact, they are much more likely to solicit a mating from this upright posture than from the lowered posture. And that fit our intuition from all the time that we've spent out there watching these birds. So do males respond to this? Are they adjusting their displays according to the probability that that female is actually going to mate with them? And so to do this, then we needed a more sophisticated robot. So this is the second generation robot. This is what it looks like on the inside. And so this is when it looks like an escaped rotisserie chicken. And that's basically, we took a resin cast of a body form. You can buy a sage-grouse female body form from taxidermy supply companies. And we just made a cast of that and used that to build the shell of the bird. And then this is the stage where it looks like a rotisserie chicken into some weird stuff. And then this is where I'm starting to get it dressed up like a real bird. In order to get the feathers to move appropriately, I ended up using a pair of Spanx and also basically anything I could find at Walmart that would work to do what I needed it to do. And this is the finished product. And so this is once she's all dressed up and ready, and this is 4-wheel drive, so it's much better than the last version. And we call her Snooky. And so here she is. She can peck at the ground, and so she's tilting forward to peck at the ground, and that's the foraging behavior. Or she can spend more time upright, sort of in the general direction, facing in the general direction of the male, which is the more interested behavior. And we can drive her out to wherever we need her to be. Though she did occasionally topple over, but we would map out a path the day before. Okay, so our questions and hypotheses. The first was, do males respond to differences in female behaviors that indicate interest or lack of interest in mating? And then who adjusts more? Is it the successful or unsuccessful males that are adjusting more in response to these female behaviors? And so we tested 2 alternative hypotheses. The differential social skills hypothesis. We proposed that successful males might be better at responding to female signals and cues, allocating more effort towards interested, high-value partners. And an example of this comes from work on wolf spiders, where they found that this is exactly what happens, that when a male is courting a female who's more likely to mate, they invest more in that courtship. So that's one possibility, is that they're just the thing that separates successful and unsuccessful males is how good they are at assessing that probability of wanting to mate. And so this would predict that successful males would be more responsive to female behaviors. So the red is the successful male. This is uninterested or interested. And the unsuccessful males we expect to basically display at a mediocre level all the time. And then another possibility is differential constraints. So successful males may have less need to conserve effort and a better chance of convincing an uninterested female to become interested. And so they may court both at a high effort. So if they're less constrained, they may just go for it. This female has approached them, so she's close. That means she might become interested. And so successful males may just go for it, whereas unsuccessful guys, if they're saving their energy, may really only try if she's showing signs that she's interested to mate. So an example of this comes from hanging flies, where they found that their males do basically this, that it's the unsuccessful guys that are actually more tactical about using their energy. And so this predicts the opposite, that unsuccessful males will adjust more, and successful males will basically display at a pretty high level in both situations. And so to test this, we went out with the robot. This is actually the next generation after the one you saw in the video there. And so we tested 52 males on 3 different leks, and each male we measured with interested, uninterested, and then we also looked at their behavior in natural courtships. And we found that the effort towards the robot is related to the effort towards real females. So it strongly predicts how they respond to real females, so that's good, right? We want to validate that this assay is telling us something about their natural courtship behavior. And my student Anna developed a very sophisticated hidden Markov model to look at these different display behaviors, that complex pattern of strutting. And I am not going to get into that, but suffice it to say that these models are all developed this way, taking into account the treatment, distance, date, order, and identity. And so what did we find? We found, if you look at the number of matings, right? So this is how successful the male is, and this is his courtship effort, normalized to the average here. And more matings are coded with red, just so you can get used to seeing it that way, because that'll be true in the following slides too. But basically, you can see that males that invest more effort in courtship are more successful in mating, right? So there's selection for males that strut more, which is something that many past studies have also found, so that's good. But despite that female preference for high effort displays, males aren't always displaying at their highest effort. They're still adjusting and displaying at different efforts at different times. So when are they making those adjustments? And so here we found that successful males display more with the robot present and less when females are absent than unsuccessful males. So here we have their effort when there are no females around, so it's just males on the lek, and here's their effort with the robot. And this is similar to what I was telling you that we found before with our earlier robot. So the guys that are strutting the highest level with the robot around are toning it way down when there's no robot around. And the unsuccessful guys that are the white dots here are just kind of all over the middle here, right? Does that make sense? So this is the same courtship tactic that, that I told you about that we tested with that first robot, and so it supports that earlier result. And so now, do they respond to this interested or uninterested treatment? So this is the change in effort from the uninterested to the interested. And you can see that on average, males are increasing their effort during interactions with an interested female. But again, there's a lot of variability among males in how they do this. So again, we looked at how that variability relates to mating success. And so this plot shows you the courtship effort with an interested female and a courtship effort with uninterested, and the white line is 1-to-1. So that would be if they have totally equal effort in both cases. And you can see that there's an overall bias towards the uninterested here, but it's really the unsuccessful guys that are the ones that are more biased towards the interested treatment, whereas the red dots, the successful males, fall much more along the 1-to-1 line, except for that dude, because there's always that dude in animal behavior studies. So unsuccessful males bias their effort more than successful males, and successful males seem to be more consistent across those treatment types. And so that's consistent with this differential constraints hypothesis that we set out to test. So do males respond to differences in female behavior that indicate interest or lack of interest? Yes, they do. Who adjusts more, successful or unsuccessful? We found that unsuccessful males were adjusting more, supporting this differential constraints hypothesis. So in sage-grouse, successful and unsuccessful males have different tactics in response to female signals. We think that these successful guys, if the female approaches him, he has a chance to convince her to mate, and they just go for it, whereas the unsuccessful guys are using that adjustment tactic. So in that case, there may be different tactics from successful and unsuccessful. And in bowerbirds, there appears to be one optimal tactic, and males differ in how well they execute it, right? Which is that they should be responding to those differences in female crouching. And that's similar to that other response that we measured in the sage-grouse, where they're responding to proximity, right? In that case, there was a better and worse way to do it, and they differed in how well they pulled that off. So there's a number of different kinds of tactics that we may see. And in both species, we needed to study female behaviors and male responses to gain a more complete picture of how sexual selection acts on these sexual displays and the importance of social skills and behavioral evolution. So just measuring the elaborate traits alone, you don't see how all of these things are playing together during courtship. Okay, so some of the work we're doing now, just for these last, I guess I have 5 minutes or so. So I'll tell you about some of the work that we're doing now. So our next step is to scale up and look at allocation of effort in this whole marketplace of the lek. So there's not just one male and one female out there. There's lots of interacting individuals. And so far, we've been sort of looking at it just in terms of the dyads, but we're trying to look at this whole marketplace, this network of interacting individuals. And so one thing that we're doing to get at that is by looking at outside options. And so this is being done by my graduate student, Ryan Logsdon. So now we have our 2 newest robots that we can send out onto the lek at the same time to test what's called the outside options principle. So this is a principle from economics. The outside options principle, or OOPS, states that you should only abandon a negotiation with an inside option if the outside option is more valuable. So if you've already started courting one hen, you should only give up on that and switch to another hen if that second hen is potentially more valuable, based on negotiation theory. And so we can send one robot out and get the male started courting that robot who's showing uninterested behaviors, and then send a second robot out and have her either also uninterested or looking interested, and see if he then switches his effort or tries to balance his effort and court both. So we're measuring this right now. So we did these experiments with multiple robots, and the analysis is underway. She's just on the verge of getting these models working. So we can give you the answer to that, but we don't know yet. Another thing that Ryan's been doing as part of her dissertation work is looking at how information flow affects all of these kinds of behaviors. So how does the structure of the sagebrush on lek affect the microhabitat use and courtship behaviors? So these are two example leks. This one flooded, it's not normally a lake, but you can see it's just a wide open grassy field, and that's sort of a classic lek. But other leks that have been used for as long as we've been out there studying them are very sagey, and the birds are out amongst the bushes. And so it's much harder to see other individuals and see females when you're surrounded by sagebrush. So you might expect that there'd be very different social dynamics in these open leks versus these closed leks. And so to respond effectively to these female presence, proximity, and behaviors, as well as to competing males need information, right? They need to see and hear what's going on. And so in 2017, we created high-resolution TLS maps of the lek. So this is a ground-based LiDAR, terrestrial laser scanning. So you can make a 3D map of the lek down to the sagebrush level. And so this is an example of some of the maps we get, and you can move things around in space, so you can put down birds at any location and see whether they have a line of sight or not through all of the different shrubs, as well as the topography, but even down to the individual sagebrush bush. So this is a single sagebrush bush scanned. So if you scan it at high resolution, you can really get everything, basically. So we can plop the individuals down onto these maps and see who can see who at any given time. We know who can hear who based on sound propagation. And so we can look at information flow across these leks. And so to place birds onto those maps, we used overhead cameras. So it's just a GoPro looking down on the males so that we can put them down into the map. And then we did some robot experiments where we would send the robot out into these different habitat types. And so one of our other goals in this is to inform efforts to restore lek habitats. So wildlife managers are convinced that open leks are the best, and so they're actually going in and mowing areas that are sagey, even if they're already being used by the birds, which I question the logic there. And so part of what we want to get at is how they're using these different lek habitat types and how it relates to reproduction. And so again, analysis is underway. This is what this looks like from above, by the way, looking down on the male sagebrush and sage-grouse, sorry. So these are the sage-grouse in the image, and this is the open lek, and those are our sage-grouse right there. And you can see the cow pies from above kind of do look like a female sage-grouse, so I don't know, maybe it's not totally crazy. I'm gonna just, I think I'm getting close enough on time that I'll jump forward here to the conclusions. Okay, so measuring courtship tactics and interactions relative to fitness, we gain a more complete picture of how sexual selection acts on male display traits and how sexual selection can favor social skills. So we start thinking of social skills as a sexually selected trait, just like the peacock's train. And the results also help us understand the role of habitat in the evolution of lek behaviors and how habitat structure relates to reproduction, which complements our conservation-focused research. I skipped over some of that research just now. We're looking at how diet choice affects these dynamics on the lek by tracking the birds across the landscape and looking at the chemistry of the plants that they prefer to eat. And that relates to our understanding of what happens on the lek, but it also gives us a lot of information about what makes good sage-grouse habitat. And so sage-grouse have been an important model system in evolutionary and behavioral biology for decades. So we've been studying these guys for a long time, and we have learned a lot about sexual selection and a lot about lek evolution. This is the cover from Nature magazine in 1932, and it just looks just like that guy right? So, and going way back, humans have been studying these birds for a very long time. So this is the chicken dance of the Shoshone tribe, which overlaps with our field site, and there are sage-grouse tail feathers in the bustle of this dance. So it's based on the sage-grouse display, and sage-grouse were a very important part of the diet. So humans have been relying on these birds and studying these birds for a very, very long time. And there have been big conservation issues over the last few decades. Sage-grouse populations have declined by about 95%, and they've lost about 56% of their habitat. So this is one of the oil and gas fields where we've been doing a lot of studies looking at noise pollution impacts on the birds. And these are all natural gas drilling rigs. And that is a male, he's the last male sage-grouse on that lek, little Fred lek. And so as the landscape changes, our understanding of how these birds use the landscape and what their natural behaviors are becomes very, very important in helping to protect them. And this is what that looks like from Google Earth. So these are all these drilling rigs. Each one of these dots is another one of those drilling pads. And that's just one section of what used to be the best sage-grouse habitat in North America that's now a natural gas field. But it's not just natural gas, it's also solar panels and wind turbines. There's invasive grasses out there which promote fire, so there's a lot going on in the sage-grouse habitat and a lot of conservation needed. And so as the need for conservation action becomes more acute, there's more need than ever for communication and collaboration between researchers focused on basic and applied questions. And so we've been trying to spend a lot of time working on management and sort of pitching the importance of basic science and trying to find areas where we can ask interesting basic science questions that also help solve some conservation problems. And hopefully we can do something to help these amazing birds. And so with that, I will say thank you and happy to take any questions.
All right, amazing talk, amazing videos. I know some of you have to go now, and that's totally fine, but if you could please take a survey with you before you go. You can always scan it and email it to me, or email me and I will come and physically pick it up from you. It would be really great if we had those data. So feel free to go if you have to, but we actually have time booked in this room, and we will have snacks and stuff. So feel free to ask as many questions as you like. And we will try and pass the mic around so that everyone can hear everything. Great.
Questions about bowerbirds or sage-grouse or robots or, hey.
Hi, great talk.
Thanks.
So I'm coming from a neuroscience perspective on this. So
Is that mic on?
All right.
Okay, there you go.
I'll speak up a little bit. So from kind of a neuroscience background, these bowerbirds, you said that they exhibit a lot of variation in the way that they create or display. So there's obviously like some rule that they know they have to build the structure that kind of looks like this, but is there evidence that they're evolving or that they're adapting to or responding to females' like interpretation of that? Like,
with the bower building structure itself?
Yeah, or is there variation like caked in, or is the variation like responsive to the
Well, so what we saw
environment?
with the bowerbirds is, as I said, they spend their first 7 years of their lives looking like females. And so they fly around the valley and they'll get courted by adult males. And they'll visit these different bowers. They'll stand inside the bower and they'll even crouch downwards. And the male will continue courting. And then when he goes to try to mate, the little young male will fly away. So we don't know if the adult males really think it's a female and not a juvenile male. But they definitely seem to be doing some learning during those early stages. And so there's probably a lot of learning. It's once they start getting to be about late teenagers, and they start getting kind of half molted, half blue, half green. That's the pimple-faced teenager phase. Then they'll start building practice bowers and courting other young juvenile males, other teenagers. And so then they molt into adult plumage and try to get their own bower going. And we see over the first few years they get a little better at it. Their bower will look better each year. Their decorations look look better each year, and then they kind of plateau. So one of the males that had the crappiest bower and the worst song and dance was 27 years old. And as long as we had been monitoring him, he had been just as crappy. And so I don't know if he ever mated. So that's my sense. But we don't have enough data to fully get that trajectory, but that's my sense, is that they can get a little bit better through learning, and then they kind of max out.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah. They're so long-lived, it's hard to study their development and their life. Yeah.
Hey, Gail. So I just wanted, so the sage-grouse, that sound must be impressive. With the robots, is there any idea that there's something that's at the point of the female that's different than what you study otherwise? I mean, is there anything that...
The sound of the male recorded by the female?
From the female's perspective.
Yeah, so the reason that we built the first robot with a microphone on board was because the males, when they produce, so you see that they have these big vocal sacs, right? They're unmissable. So the sound radiates from the vocal sacs rather than from their bill. So they vocalize more like a frog in some ways than a bird. And so the sound is actually loudest beaming from the two vocal sacs. And it's 24 decibels louder this way than dead ahead, which is a huge difference. And so as you're sitting out there on the lek listening to a male, if he turns around, you'll get into one of the nulls or you'll get into one of the lobes, and it sounds totally different. And so when you watch a male courting a female, he'll rotate around, but he tends to keep her in one, is sort of a four-pronged lobe pattern of sound radiation, and he'll keep her in one of those lobes. And so it looks like the male's not looking at the female, and these early naturalists just said, the males are not interested in the females, they're only signaling at each other, and they kind of centered it all around male-male signaling, but the reality is the males are beaming the sounds right at the females. So when I learned about that, that's what got me excited to study them, is because now that you have this skill, which is beaming the sound, that's probably more important than the sound level that they can produce, because it's 24 decibels different, right? So their ability to aim becomes really important. So I went out there with that goal in mind, was to test that and to really look at that. And it turned out to be so hard to measure the sound radiation patterns that I still have not answered that question. But that's what got me excited about the sage-grouse in the first place. And I ended up looking at a bunch of different social skills, and I hope at some point I get back to getting at that, but that's why we had the microphone on board and why it does sound different to the hen than it probably does to us sitting up in the blind. Yeah. Was that did I get at your question? It was a very long answer. I don't know if I went, yeah.
Okay, also, feel free to go back there and grab some food and drinks, and we can make this more casual and less of a microphone to microphone thing. We can be like mingling and having multiple conversations at the same time. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, just maybe once more, let's thank Gail for a great talk.